Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer, and today we are once again reaching into the Washington Realtors Legal Hotline mailbag to answer your questions. Today's mailbag question is this. Buyer and seller have mutual acceptance. The seller would like to terminate the agreement. What are the ramifications to the seller if they refuse to sell? Pause. Unless the seller has a contingency allowing the seller to terminate the agreement, something like a short sale contingency, for example, then the seller will be in breach of the contract, the purchase and sale agreement, should seller refuse to close the transaction. Buyer will have a claim against seller. The buyer's claim will have the potential for recovery either in the form of damages or specific performance. Buyer's damages could include anything from the out-of-pocket expenses buyer has already made in order to pursue purchase of the property, payment of inspection fees, appraisal, and the like, all the way up to the loss of the benefit of buyer's bargain. That's the legal jargon. And what it means is the amount that the difference between what the buyer agreed to pay for seller's property and what buyer would have to pay for a similarly situated property. If buyer has a good deal, for example, on seller's property, and they would have to pay another $20,000 to get something similar, once seller breaches, they would have a damages claim in that case for $20,000. This is all speaking in generalities, of course, because anytime we're talking about litigation, there are no guarantees. There's no case that can't be won or lost. Listing brokers, you are not licensed to advise your seller about what their potential losses may or may not be. Similarly, buyer brokers, you're not in any position to counsel your buyers as to what their potential claims may be. In both cases, brokers need to advise in writing their clients to seek legal counsel. This is absolutely a matter of the practice of law when we start advising clients as to their rights and remedies flowing from a breach of the purchase and sale agreement. That said, the referral to legal counsel needs to come as soon as possible. Seller's breach may occur at the closing table when they refuse to sign the closing documents, but it's also possible that seller's breach comes well before the parties are due to arrive at the closing table. If seller indicates that seller is refusing to close the transaction, buyer may have a claim based on that indication from seller, even though seller never actually arrives at the closing table and refuses to sign the closing documents. So listing brokers, if your seller is making any indication at all that they may not be willing to close the transaction as written, you need to advise them immediately in writing to seek legal counsel. Buyer brokers, same instruction. If you get any hint that seller is threatening not to close the transaction, you need to immediately advise your client to seek legal counsel. For starters, it may take a few days to get into a lawyer's office, so waiting until you get closer to closing is always a bad idea, listing brokers or buyer brokers. But more importantly, it may be important for the buyer to proceed through all of the same steps moving toward closing and even signing closing documents in order for buyer to preserve their claim against the seller. Buyer needs to talk to buyer's lawyer to find out whether or not buyer needs to go through all of those steps in this particular transaction. Buyer brokers, you can't give that advice. You're not licensed to. Finally, seller needs to be worried not only about a claim of liability from buyers, but from the brokers as well. Both listing and selling brokers have a claim to a commission from the seller on this already fully executed purchase and sale agreement. Based on the listing agreement language, seller has already agreed to compensate the brokers in this transaction. So seller faces liability not only from the buyer, but from the brokers as well. Listing brokers, you need to advise the seller in writing immediately to seek legal counsel. Buyer brokers, you need to do the same. If you have a question on this topic or any other, please send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.